All right, this is Openstax US History, Chapter 4, Section 4, The Great Awakening and Enlightenment. So we're starting to get to the good parts here of US history, and that is looking at the long-term causes for the American Revolution. And this section covers two of them. So by long-term causes, we mean things that were at play maybe in the 60, 50, 40 years leading up to 1776. We actually talked about one earlier, but we didn't identify it, and that is just generally speaking what we're going to call the economic causes of the revolution, namely the Navigation Acts. Right, namely the Navigation Acts. Here we have two movements, one religious, one kind of scientific, that we might also identify as two major components, or two of the three major components that eventually lead to the English colonists breaking away from the British Empire. So these were sort of things that were like going on in the background. They were being experienced by a large number of people. They weren't directly tied to the short-term causes of why the revolution takes place, but they're important to know and important to understand. So much like the growing consumer revolution we talked about last chapter, cultural movements, or I should say, the consumer revolution of people in the colonies purchasing more goods from England, sharing a stronger English or Anglo identity, also helped facilitate various cultural movements. Both the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment were cultural movements that started in Europe. So we might say of these cultural movements, they went from Europe then to the colonies. So that connection was there. The first Great Awakening then was a massive religious revival. The first one, because there is a second one that happens later on in the early 1800s. Here we're kind of looking at the dates, if we had to say maybe like 1720 to 17, I don't know, we'll say 80, something like that, right? Right on the eve of the American Revolution. But what the Great Awakening is a massive religious revival, right? Massive religious revival. So we want to associate the Great Awakening as being a religious movement. And what the Great Awakening did not only increase, we might say increased church, we'll say participation, and importance, So more people were going to church. Church was becoming much more important in society. More and more people were congregating for these reasons. But also the message changed, and that was an emphasis, or a stronger emphasis, on emotional religiosity. So you can think of it this way, and this is kind of a good way to, understand the way that the Great Awakening changed religious thought. If you go back to people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, the Puritans, they were teaching a very sort of boring version of the religion, one that was very strict. Think about the way that the Puritans always wanted everybody to conform, to deny worldly pleasures. And the reality of it was that it just wasn't popular. People didn't like it. They didn't want church to be boring. And so instead, the Great Awakening preachers said, let's get emotion involved in it, right? That religion is not a thinking man's game. Religion is something you feel, right? And so we might say, and this is a good sort of saying, is that religion, this is what Great Awakening preachers and adherents would believe, religion is a matter of the heart, not a matter of the head. In other words, you don't even need to be literate in order to preach. If you feel God inside of you, that's all that you need. Get rid of the education, get rid of the educated ministry, get rid of kind of that elitism in it, and just practice religion the way that you feel it. Great Awakening preachers advocated for personal and experimental faith. So to do religion in a way that it wasn't done in the past. We might say that this had a much broader audience, right? Including what women were especially attracted to this Great Awakening message. Think about the ways that groups like the Puritans excluded women. Women were much more, as a much more sort of a bigger umbrella for everyone to fall under. And this had the impact of splitting up congregations, new lights and old lights. So the new lights were pretty much like the new school. They stressed emotion a lot. And the old lights, they were the old school. They didn't want to see any change. They said, nope, emotion's garbage. Religion is really about learning and intellect and education. So they might say, instead of emotion, education. And so you might have groups like the Anglicans or the Puritans or the Pilgrims, if they're still kicking around at this time, where those denominations are even split further into smaller groups, where you might have new light Puritans and old light Puritans, or new light Methodists and old light Methodists. So a lot of sort of religious infighting. The consequence of this was the establishment of new colleges, right? Because new preaching required new colleges. The first colleges that were created, Harvard and Yale, those were previously established as schools for ministers. But if you're going to teach a different version, then let's create new schools. And, a lot of the other Ivy League colleges were created, places like Brown University, that was initially part of the sort of variety of different preaching styles that were created at this time. Some of the most important Great Awakening preachers included people like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Perhaps the most famous sermon or speech from the Great Awakening was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in which Jonathan Edwards, a revivalist preacher, spoke in very emotional and sort of fearful terms, and it really sort of drew people in. One thing that Great Awakening preachers also did was to place the authority back in the hands of God, remind their sort of old school ministers that even though they might have control over the physical world here, and were in charge of laws, especially in those early colonies in which there's a very close connection between church and state, reminding those people that, hey, at the end of the day, it's really God that is almighty and God is all powerful, and we're going to preach things, the way that we want to. George Whitefield by far was the most popular, so I'm calling most popular revivalist. I have a list. And, pretty much what these preachers would do, as you can sort of see in this image here, when compared with groups like the Puritans, which it was very difficult to become a Puritan, these guys would just get up, give, a kick-ass sermon, and everybody in the crowd would, bada bing, bada boom, you're converted and welcome to the church. And that was it. These revivalists and these giant gatherings were kind of like the rock concerts or music festivals of like the 1730s and 1740s. Thousands and thousands of people turned out because it was engaging, it was emotional, it was entertaining, it was spiritual, and it really brought people together. If we wanted to go back to this point about having an impact on the American Revolution, right? What the Great Awakening did, we might just make a note here. We'll just go to make a note here that it brought, we'll say, diverse people together in the spirit of individualist, not necessarily individual. I will say revolt. Right here, they were revolting against some of their old preachers. It's not a far hop, skip, and a jump to revolting against political leaders. So that's the Great Awakening. The groups that gained the most in terms of followers and adherents: Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians, we might say, of them gained the most. And then there's the Enlightenment, which is another very important cultural and philosophical movement. We talked a little bit last section about a very influential Enlightenment thinker, and that is John Locke. And I think out of all of the Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke's ideas probably have the most impact on the shaping of the English colonies and eventually the United States. His idea about social contract and individual rights like life, liberty, and property. But the Enlightenment was a philosophical movement, so we might just call it a philosophical movement that stressed, amongst other things, a few important ideas. First and foremost was the idea of promoting science over superstition, also the idea of promoting reason over faith. We might also sometimes call the Enlightenment the Age of Reason, is what it's sometimes also referred to. There was also a emphasis of things like free speech, religious toleration. So we might say speech, religious toleration was part of it. And like the Great Awakening, this was something that originated in Europe and eventually spread to the English colonies, and those ideas took hold. Now, there are some very important core ideas that go along with the Enlightenment. We'll just kind of knock them down here in the laundry list. Rationalism is the ability for people to think, and this is compared to relying upon something like church scripture to understand the world around them. Empiricism is the ability not just to think, but to observe the world around you. Observe the world around you. And it's by doing these things together, by using rationalism or thinking, using logic, and observing the world around you, this is the best way to understand the world. Right? Best way to understand the world. Now, initially, there were people who were doing this in the realm of science, right? So there was a movement called the scientific revolution, where people were using observation and logic to test out, things like gravity. Isaac Newton was dealing with gravity. But the Enlightenment really kind of took this to politics and society, right? Applied it to people, applied it to society, applied it to politics, and sought to recreate human society in a different way. Rationalism and empiricism could give one the best understanding of the world. Enlightenment thinkers also believed in progressivism, that by using these things, right, that rationalism and empiricism, and this is in some ways something that underlines kind of all Enlightenment thinkers, can lead to a better society, right? Rather than being just simply at the whims of a God who has determined one way or another the way that the world's going to be. Use rationalism, use empiricism, and build society. That the idea that humans can improve. The Enlightenment was also, in some sense, cosmopolitan, which is sort of cosmopolitan is kind of a word that means sort of like worldly. Like, we're all kind of citizens of the world. We're not closed-minded in our own sort of corners of, various countries or various religions around the world. There's a certain sense of, we might say, a common humanity, even though that term cosmopolitan doesn't kind of fit there. It's usually used to describe like, very sort of, diverse worldly places, right? Like cosmopolitan towns or cities or cosmopolitan culture. It's not like rooted in like one specific area. Organizations were created based on these Enlightenment principles. The Freemasons, we might call this a fraternal Enlightenment-based society that had a lot of members that were very influential, people like Benjamin Franklin. Franklin himself is really the embodiment of the Enlightenment. He comes to personify, and maybe we'll say that, right? We'll say that about Ben Franklin. He personifies the Enlightenment. He is the Enlightenment Enlightenment. He's the Enlightenment come to life in human form. He was someone who was, like I mentioned last section, he was a Puritan, got away from the Puritan church, went to Philadelphia, established his own newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. He loved reading. And of course, the circulation of printed and literate materials was a big part of the Enlightenment. So this was Ben Franklin's newspaper. So we might say, let's call him Franklin's newspaper. It was the most widely read newspaper in the colonies. An important technology had a pretty important part in circulating Enlightenment ideas. That was the printing press, which was welcomed in the colonial world. Well, maybe not always welcomed, but there were certainly a lot of them there. The colonies, especially in the North, were some of the most literate parts in the entire world at the time. So these ideas really spread very rapidly. And the fact that the English king and the nobility who would oppose these ideas were all the way back in England only gave more kind of fuel to the fire for these new ideas to spread all over the English colonial world. Ben Franklin himself subscribed to something known as deism, which many Enlightenment thinkers did. Deism is a belief that God created, we might say earth and man, but right now does nothing, right? That God does not intervene in the world in sort of any real-time way or in a physical way. And so to subscribe to deism wasn't to say that God doesn't exist. We would call that atheism. Deism is simply that God created the universe, pushed the go button, and stepped away from it. So natural laws like the law of gravity, what goes up must come down, are always true because there's no deity that can interfere with such a universal law. Franklin also helped to improve society through various works of philanthropy, establishing hospitals, fire departments. One thing he created was the University of Pennsylvania. I think this is the first secular college. So this was the first college that was established not to train ministers for a specific sect of Christianity. Maybe the thing that Franklin was the most well known for was science experiments. He was famous in the colonies. He was famous in Europe. If there was Dos Equis in 1745, Ben Franklin would be the most interesting man in the world, no doubt about it. He was his famous key in the kite experiment found out, or observed anyways, that electricity was much more likely to strike metal than it was other objects, and so therefore lightning rods could be put on buildings in order to save fires from ravaging the town and stuff like that. So he was very much involved in this game of everything that we think about when we want to think of the Enlightenment, of mass producing literature, of a belief in observation and logic in relation to religion, philanthropy, improving society, and scientific experiments, observation, reason, etc., etc. It was partly based off of these Enlightenment principles that the last colony, Georgia, is founded. So of Georgia, we want to take note of that this is the last English colony created, right? The last English colony created. James Oglethorpe was a British general. So James Oglethorpe, we'll call this the founder of Georgia. And part of the reason, not the only reason, was to create a military barrier against Spanish Florida. So we might say England, at least Britain wanted a military barrier against Spain. Right, so that was part of the reason. But Georgia was kind of like an Enlightenment experiment, and what James Oglethorpe and others wanted to do was to take what they called the worthy poor of London. There was a lot of overcrowding and poverty and homelessness in England, and some believed of the those cut from the Enlightenment cloth that was due not because of any sort of personal failing, but because of societal problems. So the worthy poor were people who were poor, but not their fault. right? There were some people who were poor. Mostly that was just their fault. They were either lazy or they sin too much or they engage in, immoral activities. But, Enlightenment thinkers thought that even in the best circumstances, when people are hardworking and moral and, they can still be sort of dealt the wrong hand and they might be poor for that reason. So James Oglethorpe and others wanted to take the worthy poor and create a utopian. If you're not familiar with that term, utopian is kind of like a paradise. Take these individuals, simply just give them land, ban immoral things like slavery and alcohol, and hopefully create this utopian enlightened community. Ultimately, this failed. Oops. And, a lot of settlers, when they got there, moved to other colonies. People from other colonies moved to Georgia. Things like slavery and alcohol, which were initially illegal and banned, were brought in anyways. And ultimately, at the end of the day, Georgia ended up adopting the same sort of system as South Carolina, and that was African slavery and rice production.